Welcome to this deep dive. I'm thrilled you're joining us today as we unpack some really insightful research. We've got our expert guide here in the studio, and we're diving into a fascinating article that was recently published in the journal Energy Conversion and Management. And it tackles one of the most critical topics of our time, the global energy transition. Specifically, highlighting the key challenges and effective strategies for achieving a truly sustainable energy supply. This is a topic that touches everyone, right? From the power we use at home to the huge decisions major corporations are making daily, it's a field just exploding with innovation. But it's also pretty complex. And as always, our mission here is to cut through that complexity, pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, and make them stick for you. So let's get right into it.
It's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, what a topic. This paper, it doesn't just talk about clean energy in like the abstract sense. It really gets into how we can move beyond that simple idea and actually align corporate power generation decisions with the broader sustainable development goals, which is, well, it's a significant leap forward, I think.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The paper starts by reminding us that the energy sector isn't just about kilowatts and emissions. I mean, it's obvious, but
Right.
it's a huge fundamental driver of social welfare globally. Think about it. Just having access to reliable electricity can propel economic and social development, boost productivity, power education.
Create entirely new job-generating enterprises. It's foundational.
Exactly, foundational.
And the ongoing energy transition, it's absolutely vital. Vital for global efforts to mitigate climate change, sure, but also to foster sustainable development more broadly. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, it represents this universal call to action. End poverty, protect the environment, ensure peace and prosperity, all of it. Now, while some SDGs, like number 13 for climate action and number 7 for affordable and clean energy, seem like the obvious energy priorities.
Yeah, they'll jump out.
Right. But the paper highlights that there are often significant, sometimes uncomfortable trade-offs involved. For instance, the higher upfront costs you often see with commissioning renewable energy systems.
Right, investment.
Exactly. That cost can inadvertently hinder economic growth, which then impacts other crucial goals, like SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 2, zero hunger, SDG 3, good health, SDG 8, decent work, SDG 9, industry and innovation, SDG 11, sustainable cities. It's all interconnected. And that's before you even get into balancing conflicting geopolitical interests.
So it's clearly not as simple as just saying go green and flipping a switch, is it?
Not at all.
It's about a far more holistic approach. You have to consider the wider ripple effects these energy decisions have across economies, societies. That sounds incredibly complex to manage.
It is, and this is really where the core innovation of the paper comes in. It introduces a comprehensive decision support framework. It's designed specifically to bridge that gap between those abstract global sustainability targets, the SDGs, and the very concrete, practical energy choices a corporation has to make. The central idea, the hypothesis here, is that by incorporating a full spectrum of criteria, environmental, social, and technical, all guided by what we call life cycle assessment, or LCA principles.
Right, looking at the whole lifespan.
Exactly, from cradle to grave. The idea is that companies can use this to effectively select power technologies that truly align with their specific prioritized sustainability goals. This framework really moves beyond just clean and affordable. It offers a practical, measurable pathway for stakeholders to make truly informed strategic decisions.
That sounds incredibly powerful, a game changer potentially.
Yeah.
But how did they actually do this? What real-world technologies did they look at, and what specific factors did they consider to build out this multi-layered framework?
Okay, so they applied a method called multi-criteria decision analysis, or MCDA.
MCTA.
Yeah. Think of it as a systematic way to compare complex options when you've got multiple, often competing criteria. They used it to evaluate 10 major power generation options. You had the familiar ones like solar PV, large reservoir hydropower.
Big dams.
Big dams, yeah. But also smaller scale options like run-of-river hydro, often called ROR.
ROR.
Onshore and offshore wind, naturally. And then the more traditional sources, oil, gas, coal, nuclear, and even biogas. The analysis covered 3 key dimensions of sustainability: environmental, social, and technological. And for each dimension, they picked a specific set of indicators based on established scientific literature and what major corporations are actually reporting in their sustainability reports.
So grounded in both science and practice.
Exactly. It allows for a really nuanced comparison, getting away from just a simple good versus bad label.
Let's dive into those dimensions then, because that's where the real detail is. What did they measure for environmental impact. That's usually the first thing people think of with energy.
Absolutely. For the environmental dimension, they looked at critical concerns. Climate change mitigation, obviously, measured by global warming potential over 100 years, GWP 100. That links directly to SDG 13.
Got it.
But they went much deeper. Air quality, looking at things like particulate matter formation, those tiny particles,
For your lungs.
very bad, and acidification, which causes acid rain. Both tie back to SDG 3, good health. Water quality and availability were key too. They measured eutrophication, basically, nutrient pollution in waterways and overall water use. Critical for SDG 6, clean water. They also looked at resource conservation, how scarce are the fossil fuels or minerals being used. That is SDG 12, responsible consumption. And finally, biodiversity protection, land use impacts, ecotoxicity, essential for SDG 15, life on land.
Wow, that's comprehensive just on the environmental side.
It is. And importantly, the paper notes that environmental performance isn't static. It depends heavily on geography. Solar PV, for example, performs way better where it's really sunny, like the Middle East or North Africa, compared to Northern Europe.
That makes perfect sense. Location, 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 even for energy. But what about the social side? You hear less about that in energy debates, but it's huge for communities.
You're absolutely right, and the paper really emphasizes this. The social dimension focused on indicators capturing impacts throughout the whole life cycle. It addresses a whole range of SDGs. Hashtag 1, no poverty. Hashtag 3, good health. Hashtag 5, gender equality. Hashtag 8, decent work. Hashtag 10, reduced inequalities. Hashtag 12, responsible consumption. So they looked at job creation, total jobs, direct jobs, even the manufacturing jobs rate.
Different kinds of jobs.
Exactly. And fair wages, assessed through something quite specific, the employment-weighted fair wage potential, or EWFWP.
EWFWP. What's that capture exactly?
Basically, it's not just how many jobs, but how good they are. Are they stable, well-paying? Do they contribute positively to the local economy?
Okay, quality over just quantity.
Precisely. Then occupational safety, injuries, fatalities. Very important, and a really crucial one. Gender equality, measured as the distance to a theoretical 50% female workforce.
Huh. So trying to quantify fairness, too.
It paints a much, much fuller picture than just looking at the environmental footprint alone.
That's fascinating. Okay, so environment, social, then technical performance. What's crucial there for sustainability beyond just, making power?
Good question. For the technological dimension, they focused on two key categories related to long-term viability and flexibility. First, energy return on investment, or EROI.
EROI. Heard of that?
Yeah, it's a ratio. Basically tells you how much usable energy you get out compared to the energy you had to put in to build it, run it, maintain it, decommission it.
Energy in versus energy out.
Exactly. Higher EROI is generally better, means lower long-term costs, more efficient energy use over the life cycle, more net energy for society.
Makes sense. What was the second one?
The second was microgrid generation option, or MGO. This basically assesses if a technology is suitable for small-scale autonomous grids.
Like off-grid or remote communities.
Precisely. Places where connecting to a big national grid might be impossible or just way too expensive. Technologies like solar PV, onshore wind, that run-of-river hydro, biogas, they scored well here. They're suitable for decentralized microgrids.
Unlike, say, a giant coal plant or a massive offshore wind farm.
Exactly. Those need the big grid infrastructure.
Okay, so they took all these complex indicators, social, environmental, technical, crunched the numbers, and scored each technology. This is the moment of truth. What were the big takeaways? Any surprises?
The findings were pretty clear and, yeah, maybe a bit surprising for some. While solar and wind get a lot of headlines,
They do.
run-of-river, ROR hydropower, actually emerged as the most balanced and favorable option across all three dimensions.
Oh.
Social, technical, and environmental. It was the all-rounder.
ROR hydro. Not the massive dams, but the smaller river flow-based ones.
That's right. Socially, it scored well on things like fair wage potential and total employment, good, stable jobs.
Yeah.
Technologically, it got top marks. High EROI, great energy efficiency, and suitable for microgrids, so it's flexible. And environmentally, it also stood out with a really high score, only minor weaknesses in one specific land use category.
Wow. That is surprising. I definitely pictured solar panels or wind turbines taking the top spot overall.
It really makes you think beyond the usual suspects.
Were there other standouts in specific areas, though? Maybe technologies that really shone in one dimension, even if they weren't the best all-rounder?
Oh, absolutely. There were definitely specialists. Solar PV, for instance, was superior for direct and total employment and gender equality. So great for creating lots of diverse job opportunities. Reservoir hydropower, the big dams, showed strong performance in occupational accidents, meaning high safety, and also did well on resource efficiency indicators. Wind power, especially offshore wind, performed well in manufacturing employment rate, supporting local industry and fatalities, suggesting it's quite safe once up and running. And nuclear showed good performance in things like lost potential service time, meaning it's reliable and non-renewable biomass.
Interesting. So different strengths depending on what you prioritize. And then the flip side. Which technology struggled under this framework? I assume some didn't fare so well.
Yeah, on the other hand, coal and oil technologies consistently showed the weakest performance, pretty much across all dimensions and SDGs.
No big surprise there, maybe.
Perhaps not surprising, but the data backs it up strongly. Poor scores on direct employment, fatalities, gender equality, lower social benefits alongside the known environmental costs. But here's something that is maybe more surprising, or at least an important nuance. Even solar PV, right, the poster child for green energy, it showed statistically significant negative scores in categories like freshwater and marine ecotoxicity, resource use, minerals and metals, land use, and waste, non-radioactive.
So even solar has its downsides when you look closely.
Exactly. It hammers home that crucial point. Trade-offs exist everywhere. Even with technologies we think of as purely green, there's just no perfect silver bullet.
That's such a vital point, often gets lost in the conversation. Okay, this framework sounds incredibly robust, breaking down the impacts in so much detail, but how does this apply to actual companies? Are they using this kind of thinking on the ground?
Well, that's the real test, isn't it? And the paper actually did that. They applied this framework as a case study to 12 real companies.
12 companies. Which ones?
Across 3 electricity-intensive industries: oil and gas, technology, and food and beverage. And each company naturally has its own priorities, its own prioritized SDGs. For the oil and gas industry, maybe the most interesting case, hydropower was actually found to be the most effective option for aligning with their stated sustainability goals.
ROR again, for oil and gas companies.
Yep. And reservoir hydro was also suitable for some, like ExxonMobil, according to the analysis. Unsurprisingly, oil and coal were consistently unsuitable options for aligning with their SDG priorities. Though the paper does note, while these companies are investing more in clean energy, their direct spending on low-carbon tech is still only around 4% of their upstream capital expenditure.
So,
A long way to go.
a long way to go.
Okay, what about tech? They talk a big game about renewables.
They do. And here, technology industry results were maybe more expected. ROR was again an appropriate option for all the assessed tech giants: Amazon, Alphabet, Google, Microsoft, NVIDIA.
Checks out.
And again, oil and coal were found to be unsuitable. This fits perfectly with their big commitments, right?
Right.
100% renewable energy targets, carbon neutrality goals, like Google hitting 100% renewables back in 2017, Microsoft aiming for carbon negative by 2030.
Right, they need solutions that tick multiple boxes.
Exactly. It aligns with their stated goals.
And food and beverage. In the food and beverage industry, RO is actually the only statistically acceptable option for an aligned choice across the board.
The only one. Wow.
Yeah, coal and oil were, again, consistently poor fits. But what's particularly notable here, and another sign of those trade-offs, solar PV was identified as suboptimal for companies like Mondelez International and Danone.
Solar was suboptimal for food companies. Why?
Because of its lower performance in those specific SDG areas we mentioned earlier: land use, terrestrial ecotoxicity, resource use, minerals and metals, and waste. Think about it for the food sector. Issues like land use, soil health, waste. These are already huge sustainability challenges. So a technology that potentially exacerbates those, even if it's low carbon, might be a poor strategic fit for them.
That makes total sense. It's about aligning with your core business challenges, too.
Yeah.
Okay, so RR seems like a winner in many cases, but you mentioned priorities. What if a company really prioritizes one thing over others? Like environment is absolute number one, forget everything else. Does the framework still hold?
Great question. That gets into the sensitivity analysis they did. They basically asked, what happens if we change the weighting?
Tweak the important styles.
Exactly. Like, let's make the environmental dimension 5 times more important than social or technical. What happens then? And mostly, the core findings held up. ROR generally stayed beneficial. Coal and oil generally stayed unsuitable. The basics were robust. However, there were some really fascinating exceptions, which shows just how complex these decisions get when priorities shift.
Okay, like what?
Well, for ExxonMobil and Total Energies, remember the oil giants. When the environmental dimension was super heavily prioritized, both ROR and reservoir hydro emerged as suitable. Makes sense, they're low carbon. But here's the wild part. In that specific scenario for ExxonMobil, weighting environment super high, coal ceased to be a statistically unfavorable option.
Wait, coal became acceptable.
Under that very specific, extreme waiting for environment only for that specific company profile, it wasn't statistically ruled out as bad. Now, that doesn't make it good, but it shows how context and specific priorities can dramatically shift the outcome.
Wow, that's counterintuitive.
Totally.
Yeah.
Then look at Microsoft. If they weighted environment 5 times higher, no single statistically positive option emerged. Instead, it actually broadened the selection.
So.
It opened the door to all renewable options, plus nuclear and gas technologies. So a heavy focus on one area didn't narrow it down. It made more things potentially viable depending on other factors.
Okay, that's complex.
And for NVIDIA, if they overemphasize the social dimension, suddenly both onshore and offshore wind became acceptable, with offshore scoring highest because it did well on manufacturing jobs and safety metrics.
So focusing on jobs favored wind.
Exactly. And back to food and beverage, solar PV, remember it was suboptimal for Mondelez and Danone overall?
Yeah.
Well, it was not a poor option when the social dimension was prioritized. It does well on jobs. But, as we saw, it became unsuitable for them when the environmental dimension was emphasized because of those land use and waste issues.
Okay, my head is spinning a little. It really depends on what you prioritize.
That's the key takeaway. Trade-offs and synergies exist everywhere among these SDGs. Choosing a power generation technology isn't and probably shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all solution. It absolutely demands a holistic approach, tailored to a company's specific, prioritized SDGs and their overall strategic objectives.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you, the listener, whether you're working in these fields, investing, or just trying to understand sustainable energy choices and where we're headed?
I think the relevance is pretty profound. The findings strongly suggest that companies that consciously align their power strategies with the SDGs using this kind of multi-criteria thinking aren't just doing good PR. They're likely better positioned to manage both regulatory risks as policies tighten and reputational risks as consumers and investors demand more. They also build greater resilience against future shocks, whether they're economic, environmental, or social. And this study really underscores that the energy transition we're in now is fundamentally different from past ones. Previous shifts were often driven mostly by efficiency, economics, finding a cheaper or better fuel.
Right, like coal replacing wood or oil replacing coal.
Exactly. Today's transition is overwhelmingly influenced by social and environmental imperatives. It's driven by values and long-term survival, not just short-term economics. And this framework provides a powerful, practical tool for everyone involved, companies, investors, policymakers, to make informed, truly sustainable energy decisions that go way beyond just counting carbon molecules. It's about seeing the whole interconnected picture.
Understanding the full life cycle, the human impact, the planetary impact, all at once. Not just one single metric. Wow, what a deep dive into an incredibly timely and complex topic. And that really is our deep dive for today. I hope this discussion gave you some surprising facts maybe, and definitely a clearer picture of the complex, critical decisions being made right now in the global energy transition. It's genuinely fascinating to see how this kind of detailed research can help guide such fundamental choices for companies worldwide, choices that impact so much more than just their own bottom line. So here's a final thought for you to mull over. The paper subtly suggests consumer preferences will heavily influence future demand, especially in industries like oil and gas. If businesses are increasingly trying to align their energy choices with specific SDGs, partly to manage risks, partly for their public image, what new pressures or maybe opportunities does that create? Especially as you, the consumer, become more aware of these specific trade-offs and impacts we've talked about, your choices, your awareness, it can have a far broader ripple effect than you might think. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive.